what I will do at the next 20 minutes, really focus on employment issue. And, to livelihoods, I would, kind of touch on at the end, or rather to talk about why I'm not able to speak so much about livelihoods. Now, on employment, in development, in the first instance, you could say is about enabling people to find work of a certain quality that would give them a decent income to lead a decent life. I know development is much more than that, but somewhere employment is at the core of it. Work, however you define it, is at the core of that. Now, the larger question really over the past 60 years is that we have tried to grapple with is how do we generate enough high productivity employment. I emphasize the word high productivity in the sense that you see in India where there is no such thing as social security, the alternative to starvation is you have to find work, whatever work, unless you're from well-off households, if you don't find work, you starve, okay? So you find whatever work is available. So much of work that is there is low productivity work. It doesn't give you much of income. You just about manage to make ends meet. But ever since the beginning of planning, this has been the issue, that how do we generate high productivity work, and have we succeeded there? Now, today I would like to focus on two aspects more recently, that over the past decade, specifically over the period of rapid growth, how well have we done in generating employment in the first instance? Second, how well have we done in generating high productivity work, as I call it? Now, that is this whole issue of inclusive growth, inclusive with respect to work and employment. Has it been inclusive? Second, a related question is how have we done again in the past 10 years or so in terms of employment for the young and employment for the educated young? Because we know that India is now very much a young population. The future next 30-40 years there's going to be huge growth of the young population, and education is going up. People are going to colleges, so in much larger numbers than before. So are we going to be able to generate enough work for employment for the educated young? Now, what I will do here is just to give you a bird's eye view of how we have been doing in the past 10-15 years. I won't get into too much detail, rural, urban, men, women, only where absolutely necessary. And there is a huge amount of literature and there's a huge amount of controversy, debate. I'll keep out of all that because I don't think that's what you would be interested in. And when I say a bird's eye view, I largely draw information from one particular source, that is the National Sample Survey. For most of you are probably aware, that is perhaps the one most credible source of information that we have. They've actually been providing data on employment really from the 50s, 60s, on employment, with all the difficulties of how do you measure employment in a Indian society where, from Adivasi households to people who work in glass-fronted offices. There are problems, how do you measure work, how do you measure employment? But they have done as good a job as possible, but there are problems, but I'll, abstract from all those problems. What I'll do is I won't frighten you with too many slides, as I mentioned to Seema, rather than read out the numbers, I thought it's better to be up there. Just a few slides to give you an idea of how we are doing. And I will, okay. The first slide I have is on the number of workers. Recently you see in the papers people referring to jobs being created. It's not really jobs. Actually, what we have from the National Sample Survey, the NSS, is an estimate of the number of workers. Okay. Now, what I put here is from 1983 to 2011-12. Those are different years in which the NSS has conducted its national surveys. Just a minute about those two columns of principal status and subsidiary status. Now, what the National Sample Survey does is, for principal status, it asks a person, over the past year, have you been working for the larger part of the year? Okay. So, I mean, that's meant to mean if you've been working for more than 182 days, then you are counted as a worker by the usual status, principal status. Then also about 20 years ago, they started looking at another aspect, that recognizing the seasonality of work, irregular work, and also that many women moved in and out of work, they asked the question, over the past year, did you work for at least 30 days? Okay. Then if you were, then you were counted as a worker by the subsidiary status. So these two they always give you numbers according to principal status and principal and subsidiary status. So this is what you can say. The second set of numbers is larger, more encompassing, and that's why they are always larger than the first. Now the two sets of numbers are there. I've drawn from two different sources. One is an article published in the EPW last year. Another is something a young colleague of mine is working on. It's going to be published soon. His figures, Abhishek Shaw's figures, are in brackets, So there's a bit of overlap and there's a bit of difference because of how it's estimated. Now, this is what it's been like since 1983. The number of workers, usual status, has increased from 303 to, I'm talking now about principal and subsidiary status, to about 477 million. Most recently, that's a survey done last year. More of that later. Now, rather than look at the actual numbers, how has it moved? How have they increased in the past, first instance, past 20 years? And you will see there's a huge set of fluctuations. That the periods are different, of course. I'll come to that in a minute. You can see that it shoots up to about 60 million workers, an increase in the period 1999 to 2004. Then it plummets, and then again it increases. Now, what I've done here in this table is to reduce everything to average increases per year. Now, this is not, many economists would quarrel with this, but what I've done is, you see the NSS survey is done periodically, usually done once in 5 years. Most recently, they did a repeat survey in 2 years, but I'll explain why. But they do it every 5 years, but the periods are different, so I thought to make sense, we could reduce it to what the increase was every year, okay, in each of these 5 plus 1 period. Now here you get a better picture. Let's just focus on the right, the last column. You can see that the increase in the number of workers, or if you want to call it jobs, the increase in the number of jobs fluctuated wildly. It really increased the period 1999, 2000 to 2000, that 5-year period, about close to 12 million new people entered the workforce every year. But look at the next period. It really fell to less than a million, just not even a quarter of a million people got jobs in that period, which is also, and I'll come to that, the period of very, very rapid growth. Now, how do you understand this? What was been happening in the past 20, this is a 30-year period, but particularly in the past 20 years. Now, here, I present figures, employment growth annually in million. Second column, you just put it aside for a moment. And the third, I've given you figures on the growth in GDP. Okay, each period, what is the average growth in GDP? Now, here you will see that there is simply no correlation between the pace of growth and the extent of which jobs have been created in the economy. Just look at, the first, forget the 1983 to 94, but even there, the growth was, just over 5% a year, but that's one of the periods where the number of jobs created was the second largest. Then, as growth picks up, the number of jobs created per year declines. Then it shoots up, even as growth declines a bit. And most puzzling is in the next period where growth was the highest, over close to 9% a year, and yet the number of people who found work every year was less than a quarter of a million. Now, just what has, you can just give a bit of speculation. You see, what happened was this period, 2004-5, 2009-10, was coterminous with the UPA's first term, the period of the 11th plan, where there was a promise of 50 million jobs to be created. And suddenly these figures came out saying that not 50 million, but just about 1 million jobs were created. So there was, it was not said explicitly, but it seemed that a decision was taken because the figures didn't look good to have another survey, not after 5 years, but within 2 years. And that's why in 2011-12, the NSS did another survey saying that 2009-10 was a drought year, so that would have, made the figures look less good than they actually are. So let's do another survey. And that was done in 2011-12, which showed an improvement, but not a significant difference when you look at the longer period. Okay, I'll come back to this non-farm thing a bit. So why did these fluctuations take place? Why is it that in certain periods so much specifically 99, 2000, 2004, 5, why was the pace of employment creation so high and why did it decline? Now, there are various theories, but let me offer you just one. Incidentally, when this took place, this large increase took place in 99 to 2004-5, there was even talk of eliminating, people saw, some policymakers saw the end of unemployment and end of problems of jobs by 2012. Well, we are now in 2013 and we know that is simply not the case. Now, what seems to have happened, and this theory is something that I subscribe to, that in that period, 99, 2000, 2004, 5, was also the period when agriculture was doing rather poorly. Okay, so a lot of people of distress entered the labor force. Okay, and the figures show that the increase was a large number of women workers who entered the labor force to find work to supplement household income. That contributed to this jump. Okay. Then in the subsequent period, when agriculture sort of revived, we also had the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Program, that things looked better. So those occasional workers, women who had entered the labor force, withdrew. And there's also the theory that some of that withdrawal was of young women workers who then entered the education stream. Those who have looked at the figures closely find that, yes, there was a withdrawal from the labor force to enter education, but the larger withdrawal was of those who got out of the labor force. Okay? So when things were bad, people were pushed into the job market or the labor market, and when things improved somewhat, they withdrew, which explains why from an increase of close to 12 million employment opportunities a year, it plummeted to 250,000. There are sort of differences, etc. Now, subsequent period, I mean, once you cover the period 2009-10, 2011-12, 2011-12 was supposed to be a good year, but even then you see that the increase is nowhere compared to what it was in the early 2000s. Now, what happened in the early 2000s comes closest to what we now call jobless growth. Okay, you see that growth has accelerated. It was the highest ever in the planning period, and yet the extent of employment creation was so low. Okay. Now, in addition to this, there are other. I won't get into this. During the discussion, we can talk about which sectors were doing well, which sectors were not doing well. But one thing we would like to talk about is what happened to employment in the manufacturing sector. Okay, I'll come a moment to agriculture and the other sectors, because the key in some sense to the job problem is supposed to be in the manufacturing sector. Now, there is a bit of controversy and the differences. Maybe when later during the discussion, Chandru could amplify a bit. It seems to be one school of thought says that, look, there was an acceleration in job creation, regular jobs of salaried people between 2003 and 2008, okay, which represented a turnaround. Yet others say that yes, there was an acceleration, but what you really find is a return to the earlier period. There was no great change, but the work that was lost, jobs that were lost in the 90s were sort of recovered for a few years, and we are now where we were in the mid-90s, so there were no great differences. Some others have looked at the figures much more closely, the NSS figures, find huge job losses after the crisis broke in Tamil Nadu and Gujarat. Okay, Tamil Nadu in the textile industry and perhaps in Gujarat in the diamond industry. But that's very much an area of controversy, but it's kind of another 5-10 minutes.
Sure.
Yeah,
you might explain the distinction between the first and the second column.
Yeah, I just coming to
employment, a subset.
Yeah, I just coming to that. You see, the one change that seems to have taken place, and when I conclude, I'll talk about that, is about non-farm employment. Now, what I have here is the first column is the increase in total employment, that is in cities, towns, villages, in all sectors. Okay. Now, non-farm employment here is actually all workers in all sectors other than in agriculture. Okay. Now, what has been happening since the 80s that in small ways people are moving out of agriculture. They may remain in the rural areas, some of them may migrate to urban areas, but for various reasons, again I'll speculate on that, they are moving out of agriculture into other occupations. That figure is the number of workers in non-farm employment. Outside agriculture, either in non-agricultural activities in villages or in the cities. Now that has actually increased more in the more recent period. It shows a considerable jump. Now why has this happened? Now this is important. Why has this happened? Again, the jury, as they say, is still out. There's one school of thought says that it is the result of distress. People are being pushed out of agriculture because agriculture has not been doing well. They move out of, those with very small land holdings, those casual landless labor, they move out and supplement their income with increasingly depending on work outside agriculture, or they migrate. Now, there's another school of thought that says, no, what you're not seeing is that there is certain dynamism taking place in rural India outside agriculture. In certain states, in certain areas, there are activities that are taking place which largely independent of agriculture, which is attracting people and able to provide employment. It's still not settled, so people are still asking, but it has been noticed that there has been this change. Now, very quickly, now let me talk about youth and educated youth employment. Now, the picture for of employment among youth and among educated youth is unfortunately very dismal. And specifically among educated youth, that is, educated, that is the ages of 20 to 29, unemployment rates, and I'll just talk about that in a minute, in the rural areas can be between 4 and 5%, and in urban areas between 8 and 12%. Okay, this is for 2009-10. Now, even as I said in the beginning, to talk about unemployment in Indian society is meaningless, but even in that situation, you find that the youth are not able to find jobs, and that segment is showing rather high. Most distressing is among the educated youth. Now, there the extent of unemployment can be some estimates were close to 20%. That is 1 out of 5 of somebody who has a degree, whether it's a liberal arts degree or an engineering degree or a diploma, is unemployed in the age of 20 to 29. Very high between the 20 and 25, and then it falls off. Average, one estimate says over 20%. For graduates, it's 18%. Those with diplomas, it's 22, 23%. And it's the highest among urban women. Okay? And that seems to reflect some kind of discrimination against employing. These are women who are in the labor force. They're not outside. These are women who are in the labor force looking for jobs. The chances are, if that you're a woman who's a graduate or a diploma, then between 20 and 25, you're not likely to get a job immediately, and it may improve, the figures show, after you're 30. Now, before summing up, I'll just, 2 slides, I'll just run you through. One is this slide just gives you an idea of what changes are taking place. As I said, the changes are very slow, but I'm dividing the sectors. This is primary, that is primary is agriculture, forestry, fishing, etc., the workers in that sector. Secondary is in manufacturing and construction. Third is tertiary, or better term would be services. And what you see over the past 10 years is some change, okay? And what is significant is for the first time in 2011-12, the number of workers in primary sector fell below 50%, okay? It was about over 70% in the early 50s. It's gradually fallen. It's the first time. And you also see a movement. This is the puzzle, the shift towards secondary. Now, these figures are very tentative. I won't swear by them. A shift towards secondary, that is the manufacturing sector and construction. And related thing that's very important is what form of employment. You said there is self-employment. You can be working as a casual worker, and what many would aspire to is to form regular employment, which assures you not only of a job through the week, but also regular salary with benefits, etc. And there again, you see self-employed is more or less stable. It hasn't changed. By self-employed, you can be a cultivator, a small farmer in the rural areas, or you can run a petty trade establishment in the cities, or some kind of repair establishments largely of your own or with family. Regular wage, interestingly, again I said I won't swear by these figures, we need to look at them a bit more closely. There's a decline in casual work, which is important, in terms of, it's a positive development that casual work is important, and there's an increase in regular wage. Now, it's a bit of a puzzle to me, because if there is no great improvement in manufacturing, then where is this shift from regular wage taking place, okay? Then one of the others may be incorrect. Okay, I won't inflict more slides on you. I'll just conclude by going back to this issue of inclusive growth. Now, clearly, we see around us, especially if you're in the cities, you find people working in IT, finance, logistics, etc. And you can tell yourself that, look, there is this explosion in jobs compared to the 80s and 90s. Yes, but also not true, because what you're seeing is just a very, very small segment of the labor force which has benefited from jobs. But what the figures tell us, and they're not lying, is that the promise of creating 50 million jobs, for example, during the 11th plan has fallen flat. At the best, you had 15 to 18 million new people finding, additional people finding work in those 5 periods, and that is very, very small compared to the growth in the population and the extent to which new people are entering the labor force. Third, it's quite obvious that there's no connection between growth and employment. So those of us who criticize growth for being non-inclusive, for not creating adequate, the figures don't lie. Much as you may do repeat surveys, etc., they just don't lie. Fourth, employment is still largely self-employed, and the primary sector remains the single largest employment sector. But there are changes. There are slow changes. Primary sector coming down, the shift towards the secondary and tertiary sector, the small shift towards regular employment, which I spoke about earlier, which is a bit of a puzzle. Educated unemployment, I said, among youth is very high. 1/5 of men and women, 1/3 of women in their 20s being unemployed is simply unacceptable. And among the young, as I said, it's also very high. The one significant change is, as I said, the shift towards non-farm employment. In the rural areas and in overall, there is a shift, but whether it's distress-driven or whether it's demand-driven, we don't know. Obviously, if it's distress-driven, it's not a very positive thing, but if it's demand-driven, then it's something to welcome. So on the whole, if you ask me, my view, I said there's a major failure here. That Chandu will talk about the poverty figures. The poverty figures, yes, however you measure it, other than one criteria, will show a decline. But the employment figures simply don't look good, however much you massage them, and they look particularly worrisome among the youth. Okay, thank you.